We know that we're being asked to provide a wider and wider range of support and services to research and teaching functions across our institutions, while pressures on our budgets grow. And actually, we know that the pace of change is not about to slow down. We also know that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that our workforce is diverse and represents the communities that we serve. We were certainly talking in one of the parallel workshops sessions this morning very much about that. Our panel experts this afternoon will explore the challenges and opportunities in developing a diverse and inclusive culture and an agile library workforce for the future that has the attributes and skills to flourish in a continually changing environment. So if I can just introduce the panel, and starting from your left at the end, I'm delighted to welcome Regina Everitt from the University of East London. Regina has considerable experience leading teams and organising inside libraries and beyond, and she's been a driving force in the work exploring the experiences of BAME staff in our member libraries. Next to Regina, I'm also delighted to welcome Gary Loke from AdvanceHE. Gary is an expert on diversity and inclusion, and he's recently contributed to the collection Dismantling Race in Higher Education, Racism, Whiteness and Decolonising the Academy. Vijaya Nath will be a familiar face to many of you at SCONUL, and she gave a very impactful speech a couple of years ago here on leadership at this conference. Vijaya has worked in higher education and in health, developing and delivering leadership training and development, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome her back. And next to Vijaya, and also very pleased to see Nick Poole and to welcome him back. Nick Poole, of course, is from CILIP. He's been doing a great deal of work on the development of professional skills and thinking about developing and diversity and inclusion across the profession. And he's, of course, an old friend of SCONUL's. So we've asked each of our panel members to say a few words about their own experience and their perspectives in thinking about how we develop the workforce, and a workforce which is agile, as I say, for the future. And once we've heard from our panel experts, we will open the panel to questions from the audience and from yourselves. So I'm looking forward to a very good debate. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Difficult bit to start first. Good afternoon. So I sort of come at this from the perspective of an employer whose sort of client base, my student base, 70% of whom are BAME. So when we look to recruit staff members to work within their teams, we need staff members who represent that student population, so that our students can feel that there's a place for them in the academy and beyond. And if they don't see themselves, they don't feel included, as it were. Also, the attitudes of the staff members that we bring on board have to be those who kind of understand the population, who are willing to listen to what their challenges are and who can support them to success, not judging them for where they are, but helping them to develop and become successful in the world beyond. So when I think of the workforces of the future, we really do have to make sure that we reflect our client base, our student base, certainly in the higher education sector. The other area of interest for me for our workforce of the future is that they are digitally fluent, able to engage with technology and all that means. There's a lot of literature about artificial intelligence, but we also need to be challenging the premises for some of the interpretations, the approaches that are taken through artificial intelligence. And so we need to have staff members who are confident enough to actually challenge those premises, actually be a part of those teams that are making the assumptions behind the algorithms and the analytics as well. But I think overall, our future population has to be adaptable and resilient, because when you're hired into roles, and you as directors will know this, you may be brought on for your specialism in library and information sciences, but you're hired as a senior member of the senior management team for your institution. And many of you, there are a number of you in the audience who started out with one portfolio and have loads of other responsibilities as well. And I think we need to train our staff members in being able to be adaptable and resilient. If you think of some of our structures, sometimes our staff members challenge us if we're asking them to do something that's slightly outside of the portfolio. I wasn't hired to do that. That's a thinking that we need to challenge and to develop them to move beyond. I think I'll sort of stop there, but in thinking about technology, I remember when the self-service machines were first introduced in libraries and how that threw populations. I think we need to train our staff members to move beyond that, to expect the unexpected, and to feel confident and competent to be able to take whatever, sort of technology and our changing landscapes throw at us. So definitely resilience and adaptability are key for me.
Good afternoon, everybody. Regina, I feel like you've just read off my page. So, by way of introduction, I'm Gary Loke, and I'm the Director of Knowledge and Innovation for AdvanceHE. For those of you who don't know who AdvanceHE are, we are, the way I describe it, is an old but new organisation. We were formed last year through a merger of 3 university sector agencies. So we were the Equality Challenge Unit that looked at equality and diversity for the sector, the Leadership Foundation for Higher Education that looked at our leadership development for the sector, and the Higher Education Academy that was our pedagogical practice centre. We merged to form one organisation this year. And it's been a fascinating and interesting journey for me in terms of thinking about where the intersections of those 3 things lie. So for me, this conference is really fascinating in the sense that my personal background before the merger was that I was at the Equality Challenge Unit for 11 years. And so I have a deep interest in kind of inclusion, diversity, and equality in the university sector. And bringing that together with thinking about leadership and how that plays into leadership and how that plays into our curriculum design and our pedagogy, that has been really, really fascinating, and how we try and bring that together. So that's my real interest here. And I think I really welcome the fact that SCONUL has been looking at, in terms of what is the diversity of the workforce and what needs to happen, or what would you like to see happen in the future. But I would flip that back to say, actually, it's not just the diversity that you need to be looking at. It's the inclusion half of it as well. It's not just about the numbers and getting people who look like us within library services, who look like us within the staff, but actually making people feel welcome and included in that space. And I think that's perhaps a slightly different and an interesting challenge that is for leaders in the sector. I was going to talk about digital skills, because I think that for us across the piece, we're looking at what are universities doing to skill up their staff in terms of the 4th Industrial Revolution, in terms of the skills that graduates will need in the coming period. If you look back, and there's some fascinating slides which I should have brought with me, an 18-year-old who enters university today would have been born in an era where they've only really known smartphones, Facebook, Twitter, social media. That was all there when they when they were born, and so they've had social media, they've had smartphones for such a long time that it's become inherent in the way they think, in the way they use technology, in the way they learn, in the way they have snackable and stackable qualifications and thinking. And I think in terms of a library service, I think that's where the digital part of it is really important, in terms of thinking about what is the USP of a library, but where does the digital part of it come into it as well? I'm not going to say much more than that, but that's really where my interest is how do we develop leaders that think about the skills that they need, but also how do we develop leaders that think about inclusion in that as we move forward as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Great to be back. excellence accelerators. I don't know how many of you are in the room, but you'll remember the first time I came to one of your conferences, I gave you all a new job title, and it was only Excellence Accelerator. I think for me, this is still a question of leadership. And I think in that, where you find yourself as a sector or as a profession is not different from where the higher education faculty and colleagues find themselves. I think it's always very brave, but sadly never different when you ask the questions, particularly about difference, or in this case, looking at ethnicity, that the answers you'll get will probably be predicted when you ask the questions. However, as I was saying to some colleagues when I arrived, the important thing is to look at where you're starting from. And I think with regards to equality, diversity, and inclusion, once you know that that's where you're starting from, it becomes less of a conversation about, is this really happening? Is it really happening here? And more about what do we do in terms of long-term thinking to make sure that the workforce of the future is different to what we have now. And that must be a long-term question. I mean, I'm not old enough to remember the oral tradition in knowledge in the world. And I'm not old enough to remember script. My great-grandparents were. But I'm old enough to remember print. And I think if we just go back at those 3 ages of humanity and civilizations around the world, what's now the digital age is coming at us with 1 billion pieces of information more than we could ever have produced before. And that's kind of the real challenge, is the quantity. As I said when I was here last year, if you look at the 5 forces that are going to affect everything that we do in the future, one of them is demographics. The second is looking at where power is shifting, and we see eastward is the trend. As I said last year, if China were to pull out 30% of its students from the UK's universities today, we all know in the sector that and the agencies we both have worked in and working in, that would be a massive issue for the United Kingdom. But the third area that I spoke about was green technologies, and I spoke about genetics, robotics, nanotechnology, internet versions 3 and 4, now we're in 5 and 7, things that are more sensory. And I think it's in this area of technology that we're feeling the most anxious and the most squeezed. So I guess what I'm seeing is you've got the wicked issue of looking at inclusion and wanting to make your workforce more representative of your student population. But you have this tsunami coming the other end, which is saying, at a time when the United Kingdom are focusing on the B word, when we should be focusing in the next 10 years on technology and what's coming in that revolution, you have somehow to do some parallel running. So I guess my invitation is to look at the bigger picture, take a longer term view. And there are places that are doing some things that are making a difference. You're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. So I would steal mercilessly. And really, one of the things I would really commend you is the people who participate in any piece of work like this study that was released today will want to know that something is going to happen with it, that it doesn't end up as a piece of something on a shelf. And I think from that point of view, it's really involving them as part of the discussion of the future, including digital and everything that's coming. Nick.
Wow, thank you. Fantastic. Yes, I note today that the B word was chosen by the OUP as the Children's Word of the Year on the basis of its groan factor and boredom, which I thought was a wonderful way to appeal to children. So we have a workforce strategy to 2030, and rather than reading all 30 pages of that, I thought I'd focus really on 3 main points. The first is, I think we have to acknowledge that the development of our future workforce is closely tied to the broader political and economic canvas within which we're operating. There isn't, as far as we're concerned, a single area of policy or economic development that doesn't rest fundamentally in the next 30 years on access to knowledge, information, data, the exchange of ideas. So we believe that the future has to depend for our profession on growing our employment base rather than managing kind of ongoing shrinkage, this kind of evanescence of information skills as they bleed into other things. So we know we need to build relationships, lobby, influence. We need to look at developments like leadership change, like the spending review that has yet to be announced, like the industrial strategy, and say, what is our role as a workforce in those agendas? Because those really are going to define how the sector develops. I've always believed in our work at CILIP that our profession is characterized essentially by two things, one of which is continuity of purpose, the other of which is continuous change in the models, practices, and skills of how that purpose is delivered to information users. So the key strategy I think we need to adopt as a workforce to address those is that our future lies in being absolutely clear about our values and our identity as librarians. And I also think that in order to deal with the process of continuous change, we have to embrace the idea, the habit of learning, unlearning, relearning on an ongoing basis throughout the whole of our careers. We can no longer be a profession that acquires skills at one point in our life and then simply kind of works with those skills. So then the third area that we wanted to look at is that it is really clear from your data, from our data, that we have a fundamental issue, not only with the underrepresentation of BAME people in our workforce and our collections, but also in the overall movement of people, talent, skills into and through our profession. So I'll conclude by saying that there are really three things we think we need to do in order to address that issue. The first is it is far easier to diversify a growing workforce. So we have to do more together with SCONUL and others to make sure that the profession is universally accessible, universally aspirational. I have long said that I want somebody to say to their parents, Mum, Dad, I'm going to be a librarian, and for them to turn around and really encourage them in that choice, because today I don't think they would. We also then, having made this a more aspirational sector, need to target those specific barriers. So we have to disrupt power structures that inhibit diversity and signal with total clarity that the only future we will accept as a profession is one which fully and positively reflects the communities that we serve. And then finally, and I think kind of reflecting on sort of CILIP's role in all of this, we have to understand the extent to which organisations such as ours are complicit in perpetuating power structures of inequality, and then make an affirmative decision together to disrupt those power structures. But I'll conclude by saying a quote from a kind of industry leader I heard the other day, which I think is really important, that we as humans tend wildly to overestimate the change that can be achieved in 5 years and to drastically underestimate the change that can be achieved in 20. This has to be a long-term plan. We can't afford simply to reach for the closest levers to hand. We have to decide to go forward with this for the long term.
Thank you all of you for those provocations. Can I open this conversation now to delegates? Any questions to our panel or any comments on what you've heard? And please, if you want to comment or ask a question, could you say who you are and which institution you are from, please?
John Cox, National University of Ireland, Galway. I'm just wondering, in terms of increasing the diversity of our workforce, are there any other sectors you think we could look for that have already given us good examples that we could follow?
Vijaya, you were talking about other examples, I think, weren't you?
I was saying that playfully when I moved from the King's Fund from health into higher education, I had a bet with Don Berwick, who works at the IHI, on that I was moving upstream and that what I would find in higher education was much better than I could find in health. And I was sadly, he said you'll be surprised, and I was. I think that health was pretty, if I go back 20 years ago and look at the NHS, so large organizations in which attract a variety of personality types from the country it's located in, with all the biases and everything that we grew up with. We're all capable of that. Was 20 years ago not reflective at all. And if you look at the report that's come out recently, seems to have still a lot more work to do. I think one of the things, and I'm not an advocate necessarily of this approach, but one of the things that the NHS did do was introduce something called the Race Equality Standard. Now, that's an interesting case study, and it's been proven now that at certain levels in health in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, that actually there is a composition at board level that's more reflective of the patient population in theory. My biggest example of probably good practice is a company that does architecture and engineering. They're called Everitt Consulting. And one of the things I love about Everitt is you can have a good idea at any part of that organization, and the culture that they have fostered means that you don't have to be the oldest or the one with the position of power. They work in this, what we dream about, matrix working, in a way that says a great idea can come from anywhere. And quite a lot of the cultural practice, if you look at the artifacts of how they've developed, speaks to inclusion, but excellence in thought and the field that they're leading in. So I guess for me, it would be organizations where what you do first is attract the best talent in that area. And what you do is make it possible for that talent to flourish. So those would be two examples that are very different, that have been doing work in this area, that I can see some progress has been made.
Thank you. I wonder if any other panel member had any comment. Regina? Yes.
I think in the technology sector as well, there's some good practice. When I attended UCISA earlier this year, Oracle presented, and they have they are dedicated to making sure that they've got a diverse workforce, simply because they've found that they've lost business because some of their client base said, you know, when you send in these representatives to sell me an HR system and I don't see diversity in any of your consultancy team, how on earth are you going to understand my sort of user base? And that's come up. So there's examples of that with Oracle, Intel as well. So a couple of technology companies I think are examples of good practice. Now, we know that technology in the higher education sector, we see quite strong representation, BAME representation in technology, but not at CIO level. So there's still some work to be done there. But there are pockets within the technology sector that I think are worthy of looking at.
I think I would agree with you know, both Vijaya and Regina. I think there are pockets. I mean, the technology sector is one. You talked about Everett. In private business, I think some private businesses are doing a lot better, because I think they've started to recognise. I think that the issue of the higher education sector is, we say, you know, we believe that debate and discussion will generate new knowledge. That's what universities are for. We bring people together. But then, you know, but actually what we're looking for is the same knowledge and the same, you know, it's not disruptive in that sense. Whereas I think business is starting to recognise actually what we want are disruptors to go and help us develop new business. And there are a lot of studies about how diversity brings value to business. We find, working with the university sector, that a lot of vice chancellors, a lot of leaders will say, yes, diversity is really important, but they can't really tell you why. You know, they go, as a moral feeling that this is really, really right, but we can't demonstrate the impact and the value. And because we're so metrics driven now, you know, the Org review is all about impact value, everybody drills back down to that metric. And so where we're looking at in the sector, we will say, well, you know, what we need is a metric of, you know, BME students going into employment, because that's what the government wants us to do. So we'll focus all our attention on that. And I think that's where we start to see all the red herrings in the sector, that we focus on these metric driven things, instead of saying, well, actually, what we need to do is look at the value more broadly across the piece to what this means for the university. So that's a kind of roundabout answer to say, I think there are good pockets of practice. But I think what really needs to, you know, we talked about disruptors earlier, and changing, disrupting the power struggles that inhibit diversity. I think that's a really important thing to think about, because, whenever I go and talk at events about race and racism, it's harder to talk to an audience who believe that it's the wrong thing, race and racism, because everybody thinks they're really good. We don't want to be seen as racist people. We don't want to be seen as sexist. So, people say, well, that's not me. That's not who I am. But actually, if you really look at society and believe that if that's happening out in society everywhere, if you open a newspaper, there'll be a homophobic attack in London today, a racist attack in Birmingham tomorrow, there'll be racism in football, headlines there's racism in the NHS. It happens everywhere. And if we really believe that we're a microcosm of our society that we live in, then we have to kind of believe that that happens in our institutions as well. And I think with universities, because we all generally believe that we're good liberal people that work in the university sector, it's harder to digest that as an issue.
Can I just respond to that? I mean, I think in higher education, and I'll look at my own institution where we've got, an attainment gap, something like 20% between black students and white students receiving a first. That is a compelling business reason, if ultimately you are looking at, retention metrics and success metrics, and your students are not performing at the right level. That is a compelling reason for you to think that there is something going on there. So, I mean, so whereas in the private sector, they look at their bottom line and their customer base. I think in higher education, we need to take a similar approach, look at our students.
I completely agree. And I think the criticism that a lot of kind of BME staff in the sector say is that the universities are focused on degree attainment, on students, on student outcomes, but not focusing on them. And actually, we need to join the dots. We're talking about belonging,
Absolutely. We're
talking about role models and all that. We need to join those two together.
Yeah, there's a wider picture. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Nick, did you want to?
No, I think Vijaya.
I want to, because the question was about, is there a place where something positive is happening? Years ago, so when Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General of the United Nations, he introduced a very compelling piece of work at the United Nations level. He was really fed up globally that for every vacancy in every country in the world where you're looking for a Minister of Munitions, Health, representatives that would be at the United Nations level, that there were no women on the shortlist. So he made one intervention, which was, he said, there will be no panel convened unless a woman is on the shortlist for every vacancy. And this was in every sector in everywhere around the world, so people signed up to it. It's well documented. And what happened was, of course, you couldn't magically find a woman for every vacancy, but you could find one who might be ready. And they weren't appointed if they weren't ready, but what then had to happen if they were shortlisted was they were mentored and developed so that when the vacancy came again, they could apply. That single thing pushed more women, so they were looking for 50-50 by 2020. It was a United Nations kind of initiative, and that was one of the biggest actions that has ever made a positive and really progressive piece of thinking to make sure that globally more women were coming to the fore. Because this is a wicked issue. So if you don't have enough people attracted into the profession, then therefore where are you going to find people to just bring to the top? So what he did was say we have to find people who would be interested, and if they're not ready now, they'll be ready next. And that's still an initiative that we are benefiting from globally. And the United Kingdom signed that charter. So that's kind of a global example of what you can do if you have the influence. And I would argue that within the university sector, we have the influence at Senate level and at board level to make some of these decisions, to make better, to challenge more the headhunters that keep churning over the same list of people for vacancies. But yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments from
James Anthony Edwards, Exeter. I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, so I've no idea whether this goes off in a weird direction or not. But I was thinking about the discussions about disruptive technology and disrupting power. And I'm wondering how the two relate. And on the positive side, are there opportunities through disruptive technology? Equally, we could do a long time on AI bias. But I suppose because it's grey outside, it's cheery inside, being positive about it, are there opportunities from disruptive technology to disrupt power structures within libraries and within wider HE?
Absolutely, although there are people on this panel much more eminently qualified to comment than I. But I think it's really interesting. For the longest time, success for institutions was the acquisition. It was the acquisition of buildings and resources and people and material wealth, and then you evolve hierarchies to manage that acquisitive process. And that whole model has been turned on its head. So success in the future for institutions isn't what you own, but what you enable, what you empower people to do. And it is only through disrupting the last 150 years of the development of those institutional systems and hierarchies that you're going to get to empowered people who feel enabled to take risks, enabled to play with the technologies, enabled to make change. I think the real challenge is that most of the organisations I talk to at any scale are busily trying to reverse engineer a speedboat out of an ocean liner, that actually it's much easier just to start with a speedboat and be agile and respond to the way the world is. Unlearning how to be a rules-based large-scale institution with large capital resources is incredibly hard, and I sometimes think we don't cut institutions quite enough slack in how they go through that. But I think the only answer is to take the disruptors in your organisation, give them space to explore and play, and then to celebrate when they break something in a way that's productive for your organisation.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. I think if you look at the revolution that's coming over the hill in terms of who is attracted to those kinds of roles and the new disruptive technologies, it's a very different set of people. It's really interesting, the conference that's on today on looking at women coding and who's in the game industry, where the next, there's big gaps in the UK in terms of the market, so they're going overseas to get people into that industry. I think the thing is, I've just come from doing a piece of work in a different country, not in the United Kingdom, where they have ambitions of creating what they call the medical school of the future. But to get to the medical school of the future, they have to deal with their current workforce issues. And some of those is the inability of a structure that was created with good reason to churn out people who would deliver safe care, to be risk averse, to not experiment. Yet this organization is looking at really turning curriculum design and the way people learn as doctors on its complete head. And it will be, if it pulls it off, it will be, it's long term, so you won't be able to see this until the people come out the other end. But every way in which doctors will be developed in this new curricula as an experiment and in this way that they're going about it is different to how doctors are currently being developed now. And I think I said when I was here before, I come from a family of doctors. And so I have a great appreciation for medicine and tradition and safe practice and high quality care. But what I see people are doing is making possible for someone with very little qualification but a very inquiring mind to be able to challenge the most senior person in the hierarchy by asking the question, and that's okay for the furtherance of knowledge and doing things differently. So I agree with you. I think we're sitting at a very exciting time. And I think that what's necessary is to not disengage people by making people feel that this time is only for a certain generation. I don't know how many of you have parents and grandparents, but my mother is the most adept at technology person that I know. She's better than me on every medium that has a device. And she taught herself. So I think the fact that, sometimes we have an image of where change is coming from or where the talent resides, don't be surprised. If machines are going to enable us to have more free time, then we will all be playing in a new creative space. And I'm holding on to that kind of utopian future. I'm fed up with the dystopian rhetoric of robots taking our jobs. Let them take our dull jobs so we can do more creative things.
I have to say that my most stimulating time in my career was when I ran the Learning Zone at the University of the Arts London, simply because it was a tabula rasa. There were no rules. It was a sandpit environment. And I had the opportunity to hire a fresh team of people who had no expectations, and we just saw where it went. And I really look forward to going back to that sort of environment, and I think that's what will allow us to see the innovation. If people are allowed to fail, to break toys, to be in a sandpit environment, they're not hampered by these crazy HR structures that, in order for us to get somebody in for a job takes 3 months. We need to dismantle all that so that we can be open to all the disruptors. And our staff members feel free to try and fail and try and succeed and try again.
Regina, you talked first of all about thinking about your staff needing to be digitally fluent, and I just wonder whether that notion of disruption is actually part of the fluency, because I don't know that we necessarily think about the two things together.
Well, that's right. I mean, and again, I do think it is about not being afraid to fail. But again, I mean, I'm sympathetic, because if you picture, and some of you will have people like this in your service, library assistants who've been library assistants for years. They started as library assistants in school. They will retire as library assistants. Then you have all of these, sort of changes going around. And some of them, when they may go along to the training for new technology, but they don't really feel confident. And so if someone asks a question and they don't know the answer to the question, they feel that they failed in their role. So how do we work with them to try to change that? Now, when you think about it, sort of as a librarian, certainly my approach as a librarian, because I can't remember anything. I can't remember my own name half the time, but I can remember how to find information. So even if I don't know sort of an answer to a question immediately, I feel comfortable saying, I'll have to get back to you. I need to go look it up. But we have some staff members who don't feel confident in that sense. It feels that they failed in their role. So, so it takes some creative thinking to get them not to feel that they've failed in the role. So I think my management team and I have been talking about how we can sort of, again, remind, our sort of library assistants and librarians that it's about knowing how to get access to information when you need it and not walking around with it in your head. So we have to kind of, sort of dismantle some of that thinking to maybe free up people to be able to make mistakes or say, I don't know, I'll have to get back to you.
Can I just follow up very briefly? I always think being a librarian is quite a disruptive thing to do. I mean, believing that people have the universal right of access to knowledge and information is a very powerful concept. And what surprises me is the glacial pace at which we embrace new tools with which to execute that purpose. And so we're seeing it right now. I mean, the very slow pace at which librarians are engaging with AI, data, and machine learning skills is really disturbing. We have a window of 3 to 5 years beyond which those tools are no longer for us to support our communities with. And so I would have thought that being such a disruptive profession, we would see new technologies coming at us fast and go, brilliant, we'll have that. I'll learn how to do it, we'll get on top of it, we'll break it and play with it until we can make it part of what we do for our users. But we don't. And I think there's something about how we as a sector think about the sort of fear factor around new opportunities to do that job. Because somebody described leadership to me the other day as an incomplete series of S-curves. No technology generation will finish before the next one starts. And so no sooner than we have acquired data skills for librarians, it will be a fresh set of skills that we need to engage with. And I wish we were more, digitally promiscuous in terms of engaging with these opportunities.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi there, Neil Grindley from JISC. I'm just wondering about the sort of practical things that organisations might be able to do to tackle just one small piece of the jigsaw of what we're talking about here, perhaps. And I'm thinking about the role of mandatory training. Give an example. At JISC recently, we've been talking about unconscious bias, and we've been asked as a management team to all engage with some training around unconscious bias, and we're thinking about rolling that out to the rest of our organisation. as I say, it's just one aspect of the many things that we can talk about in terms of diversity and inclusion. But how important do you think that would be for organisations to think through what should be mandatory and what perhaps shouldn't be?
Gary, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I have to be careful. I'm not trying to sell something. I think it's important that institutions think about these things. I don't want to say what should be mandatory and what should be not. I think the whole issue, I think unconscious bias is an interesting one, because I think a lot of universities have gone down that route. They make it mandatory, they put their staff through it. But if you look at the evidence base on it, the EHRC paper last year said basically by week 8, if you haven't reinforced anything, it's completely gone from your mind. And I think the thing about unconscious bias is that it sometimes means that we don't think about the conscious bias. We think actually that's why we're doing these things, and if we just overcame that, we'll be fine. I think I would much rather. And I'm speaking here specifically at race equality, because I think there are different ways of looking at things. I would much rather institutions look at ways that people behave and ways that people talk about race and ways that people engage about it. So having some kind of program, because race is emotive and a very difficult topic for many people to talk about. They feel like they don't know what questions to ask. They feel like if they ask a question, they'll be offended. Someone will be offended about it. I used to work for a rural race charity just post the Lawrence Inquiry, and we were one of the racist incident reporting centres that was set up after the Lawrence Inquiry. And we worked very, very closely with the police in that area, and these were small communities that were dotted around the Sussex Weald area. They tended to be small families who ran a shop or a takeaway in a village. Sometimes they had horrendous issues where they were firebombed. There were all sorts of issues, but we worked really, really closely with the police about how do you develop that relationship. And the most valuable thing that the police got from us was saying, actually, can we ask you questions? They were just sometimes really basic questions. They would say things like, oh, we're going to this family's house, should we take our shoes off? And my answer to that was always, actually think about the question. You follow what that family does. It's not a question about race. It's about, if that family takes their shoes off at the door, then you do the same thing. So it was a kind of a commonsensical approach to things. But the police were scared of asking these questions to anybody, because they thought if we ask and we're not seen as being culturally sensitive, then we're not doing our job correctly. So for race, I think, particularly around race, because it's so sensitive, it's actually encouraging institutions to take the first step in thinking about how you talk about the issue. How do you start to bring groups of people together in kind of safe spaces that don't kind of make people feel uncomfortable, and also don't make BME staff uncomfortable, because a lot of BME staff don't want to raise their heads above the parapet because they want to get on with their jobs. So I think that's a more important thing than just making unconscious bias training mandatory. Having said that, it's not a bad idea to do unconscious bias training, because it does make you think, as long as afterwards you put things in place to reinforce it. So you say, actually, we have unconscious bias training on recruitment and selection. But when we have a recruitment and selection process, you refresh that training to say, actually, these are things we want you to remember as you go through that process. And it's not just a one-off thing that the institution does.
Yeah. I agree with Gary in terms of I would look for evidential interventions. So what's the evidence that if we do this, that some of this will work? There's always something that you can do for the good of something, but I'd be really looking at what's worked where and how has that worked. I think it's more important to examine behaviors, and my team know I used to say this phrase until I was blue in the face: what we permit, we promote. So actually, at every stage and every element of what we do, if what we're saying in practice or on our plaque on the wall is we want to achieve X, if what we do doesn't make that so, then people will just believe what we do. So it becomes, giving people permission. I think it is deeply uncomfortable when we talk about race equality, and I think it'll be uncomfortable for everyone, because mostly people don't get out of bed to be horrible to each other. I don't believe anyone intentionally does, but I think there's a lot of unintentional harm that happens, and the usual suspects and the victims become the same, and then the narratives that get told about this get played out, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think if we're really serious about making change and taking the long view, then it impacts everything we do. It impacts how we recruit. It impacts the questions we ask. It impacts how we set things up. It impacts the times of days we do things in some cases for some populations. So I think it's about saying, what's the behavior that we're trying to get, and what are the things that we're existingly doing that are mitigating against that? Yeah, I put a very simple microscope over everything, and I'm sorry if this is very simple, but I just ask this question: how does it look? How does it sound? How does it feel? And if our gut reaction is something is not right, then you're right, it's not right. And without making a policy decision or mandating people to have to change their lives 360 degrees, let's just start by those small interventions.
Yeah, and I think if, you know, the way you're doing things just gets the same outcome, then obviously something needs to change. What came out in the report that was released today, the respondents said, you know, educate yourself. So do some reading yourself to find out what's going on, where's the pocket of, you know, good practice. But also, you can just bring in members from your client base and said, what should we be doing differently? Sit down and have a conversation. Just ask the people that you want to reach. I'm not reaching you. What else do I need to do? I think that's a good way to start as well.
I think that's really true. Can I steal a second more before I pass to Nick? There's a charity in London who the chief executive went with very good intention to race equality training. She had the intention of wanting to do something. And she came back, and the one thing she did was it made her so uncomfortable, the training, and all the talk about white privilege and everything that she had to encounter. She came back and she held a meeting with the organization. And in the organization, there were very few people from Black and Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, but there were a few. And one of them put their head above the parapet and made a meeting to see her afterwards. And I think what they've done, and I'm really encouraging them to write it up as a case study, is what came from that was a conversation that pointed out that the good intentions were not enough, because actually what that leader did every day was make it possible for this to continue. So one of the examples was, it's a charity that looks after cancer patients. None of the homes of cancer patients have names other than that from the monoculture. Yet half their patient base come from different ethnic backgrounds. So it's about different ways of recognizing, and what that individual now has done is helping and pacing the chief executive in what's being called reverse mentoring. So the chief executive is understanding about difference through spending time with that more junior member of staff, but learning from that member of staff. And that member of staff is also learning about leadership from the chief executive. But the combination of doing small things powerfully together is, I think, the thing that will take them furthest at the moment.
Not a huge amount to add, but I was asked recently what I thought was characteristic of a really fantastic employee. Actually, the one I came up with was self-awareness. That I think self-awareness is a vastly underestimated characteristic and is incredibly important. And to paraphrase, I think you can lead people to a diversity culture, but you can't necessarily make them think. And so we need to embrace the idea, which I think CILIP has promoted for a long time, that librarianship should be a reflective and critical practice, that we have to continually engage with why we do what we do and whether what we do reinforces the structures that we're seeking to dismantle. Because unless we critique what it is that we do as librarians, we tend to don a mantle of sort of implied virtue and say that we are doing good because we want to be doing good. And I don't really think that's good enough. So I definitely think some of this has got to be about encouraging everybody across the service to reflect critically on the impact of how they act.
So I think we have time for one more area for some comment or question that you would like to hear the panel's views on. Lots of hands going up. Yeah.
Ruth Jenkins, Manchester Metropolitan University. I was interested in Nick's comment about what we really want is for somebody to be able to say to their parents, I want to be in a library or an information role, and for their parents to say, woohoo,
Yeah.
which is definitely not the reaction that I got. They said, oh, you're going to be a spinster librarian. And they just had this and why do you need to go and get a postgraduate qualification to stamp books and all of that sort of thing? Now, obviously that was, 20 years ago, and things may have moved on a bit since then. But what do we actually do to make sure that people see this as something that they can engage with, that they can bring something to, so we've actually got the right people coming in from the start, and that we're not sort of fishing in an ever-decreasing pool of talent?
May I respond? What a wonderful question, thank you. I was reflecting the other day on how many tropes and ideas in our contemporary culture are actually drawn from propaganda during the war, and the fact that archetypes are incredibly powerful for a reason, that people like to establish a simple concept, and then once they own it, it tends to be irrevocable. It's like putting on a MAGA hat, people never take it off again. So I think we need to do a couple of things to disrupt that stereotype, one of which is to be different, and I think we've been being different for the last 15 or 20 years. So there are children growing up today whose interaction with the school librarian is not the archetype, is not the stereotype, is somebody who's transforming their understanding of information skills, equalities, and so on. So I think we're getting busy with that one. The other one is to do a far, far better job of communicating what it means to be a librarian. And so in my work, I get to work across 20 industry sectors. I visited librarians in the security services, in banking, on oil rigs, in far-flung stately homes, in public libraries in every community, in schools, in colleges, and in universities. And there is no platform today that showcases to an aspirational 15-year-old and her mum and dad where you can go with these skills. And that, I think, is a critical gap. And so it's one we certainly intend to close. We believe there needs to be a careers platform, there needs to be careers advice going out to schools and colleges, there needs to be a much better and more diverse and representative picture of what it means to be a librarian.
Yeah, I mean, I think curating the digital, the library of the future, the digital library, is a hugely exciting prospect. And I think that more people are starting to look at it. And I think more campaigns like This Is What X Looks Like, they have them, This Is What a Surgeon Looks Like, well, could run one for This Is What a Librarian Looks Like, because actually it's anyone. And I think, on Twitter I see some things from time to time which are amusing, but is everyone following the Lego librarian? I think that's just amazing, because lots of people look at that and it's not what they expect. I think the more you can do to push at people to say this is something that would be acceptable to you, the more you'll get difference. I remember as a child running my own library when I was in South America, because there weren't very many books, and I had a very neatly rolled exercise book with the title of every Nancy Drew book on the top and every Eden Blyton, and I charged people 1 cent. And I gained money from overdue books, but I liked the whole act of being the librarian and curating knowledge and having a bookshelf. And I think as exciting as digital is, there is, I hope, always a place for nostalgia and books. But information is going to keep coming, and knowledge is going to keep coming. And so the most important people, as I said to you before, excellence accelerators, that's what you represent. And so I think it's something that needs to be open to more people.
I wouldn't say much more, but I think I completely agree with Vijaya and Nick. I think the thing about, I guess, a librarian and career service and stuff is, it's very important to see what people do. And the story I'm going to tell, because it's my favourite story that my mum told me many, many years ago. When she moved to the UK in the 70s, she said it was the first time, from a colony, we grew up in one of the British colonies, she said it was the first time she had ever seen white people cleaning streets. And she said it was only then that she realised that white people were cleaners, because all her life she had grown up in a colony where white people only held the top-ranked jobs. And she said that was such an eye-opener for her that she realised that the world did not work in the way that she grew up in. And so, if we really want to promote a diverse library workforce, then the generation below needs to see a diverse workforce to say, actually, this is something that I can aspire to and I want to do.
Yeah, and I sort of agree with Nick about, sort of letting people know about the vast range of roles that you have in the library and information sector. If, the work on the internet, the digitization, digital humanities, there's just a whole range of the work that we're doing. We're finding that in academic libraries that we're more closely aligned with research than we had been years ago. So there are so many areas that we need to explore, and perhaps I've said this to Anne before, that we should be doing more with UCISA, for example, going in, presenting at those workshops, where those conferences where you have people who have those technical skills who might be thinking what other sort of careers or, what happens in other sectors. And they may not, know about all the range of activities happening within modern libraries. As a matter of fact, I know they don't. I think they have very traditional ideas about what happens in modern libraries. So I think we really have to infiltrate some of these conferences to let people know that it's a bit more than stamping a book.
We've more or less come to the end of our time for this session. Thank you very much. Those were really stimulating questions. And thank you to the panel as well. I've just sort of scribbled down a couple of words, quite a lot of words while everyone was talking, but I was hearing things about leadership, which I think are really important, about leaders both being self-aware and self-reflective, but also thinking about how we act and how we behave, as well as the things that we do. I was thinking about the point that you made, Vijaya, I think, about enabling people to flourish in organisations when they move into organisations, and a number of you making comments about the importance of technology and its disruptiveness, but seeing that in a very creative way, and I'm really struck by your example of the kind of the medical school students being really encouraged to stop being risk averse. So there was a lot in that conversation that I've taken away, but those were some of the things I've kind of scribbled down just now. Can I thank you all very much? Thank you. That was really stimulating and interesting. Can we thank the panel, please?